Let the word go forth from this time and place to friend and foe alike.
This is preeminently the time to speak the truth, the whole truth, frankly and boldly.
History doesn't have to be boring, buttoned up, or inaccessible. And it certainly didn't end in 1945. It belongs to all of us, and we share and add to it every day. Welcome to the History A Go-Go podcast, where I interview interesting guests, cover a motley crew of topics, and it's a place where you can sit, think, and drink all at the same time. I'm your host, Rob Mellon. Welcome. Our guest today is Max Miller. He is a talented and extremely knowledgeable video creator and host of the outstanding and entertaining YouTube program, Tasting History with Max Miller. The show has become a smashing success with nearly 300,000 subscribers and new episodes every Tuesday. He has said his love of history often led him to want to put himself in the shoes of his favorite characters from the past. There's no better way to do that than to taste the foods they tasted, and he's done that with recipes from the ancient Greeks to the American Civil War. Welcome, Max Miller.
Thank you so much for having me. I really appreciate it.
Well, it's so entertaining. As you just spoke to my son, but he got me hooked on it immediately. And I'd like to pay you one compliment. It's accessible because sometimes other shows, and it's important to show how it was, these foods and stuff were created in that time period with a hearth and cauldrons and things of that nature. But the reality is, it's also fun to try to replicate it. In your show, that's exactly what you can do. It's very accessible, and anybody can replicate these recipes if they would like.
Yeah, that's kind of my goal is to be able to, after the end of an episode, for anyone to be able to this at home. And as much as we all would love to have a cauldron and all of these, an open fire at our house, most of us don't. So
Max, you don't have a cauldron yet? I know that you said. Is that on your Christmas list? I think on one of your episodes.
Definitely something I would like. But I like to make it so you can make it in your own home. That said, sometimes the ingredients that I use are not so easy to find. So there is some digging, but that's part of the fun as well. And that's what makes it different is tasting some of these ingredients. So but I still like to give an alternative for something that you could maybe easier find, just in case. Depending on your dedication after you've watched the show.
Yeah, and we're going to try one right now because it's tradition here on the podcast to accompany the conversation with a special brew. Today's a little extra special, going truly old school with the 400-year-old recipe for hot buttered beer. Now, I'm not going to try the English accent like you do, but it was featured on one of your episodes of Tasting History. So my son and I cooked up a batch, and I'm going to try my first taste right now of this 4 centuries old recipe. And as I try it, if you wouldn't mind just giving us an overview of what I'm actually trying, the hot buttered beer. And then I'd like to know, what is the Ale Connor's role in Tudor England, which you described on your episode, which is really interesting. So I'm going to try this, Max, while you fill us in on what hot buttered beer actually is.
Awesome. So essentially, hot buttered beer is beer or ale that has it's kind of thickened and enriched with egg and sugar, and sometimes some recipes have cream and then spices. And it could be we don't know the exact reason why it was done this way. Maybe it was just because it tasted good. Maybe it was a nice way to kind of have warm beer during the winter. Excuse me. But often, the beers and wine were of less than desirable quality, especially if they had sat around for a while or gotten warm. And so this was kind of a way to mask the flavor of maybe a questionable brew that you had. And in Tudor England, there was a position that actually still exists today, a little less official, called the ale conner or ale taster. And they would go around from pub to pub. Each kind of town had one, and they would go around and test the beer to make sure that it was quality, because there was a lot of passing off bad stuff. And so this was kind of the taster quality assurance person, I guess. There are stories, though they might be apocryphal, of one way that they tested the beer rather than tasting it was to pour the beer onto a wooden bench, and then they would be wearing leather breeches and to sit in the beer and let it dry. And when they stood up, if their breeches stuck to the bench, then it meant that there was too many additives and sugars and everything, so it wasn't quality beer. But again, that's probably apocryphal, but there are definitely even stories from the 18th century about that happening, and I just love the idea of someone sitting in warm beer to test it.
Yeah, that's pretty interesting. Well, I tried this, Max, and it's an interesting taste. It's you can taste the beer. You can definitely taste the beer and the spices, but it leaves you with almost a Carmex feel on your lips, or I didn't anticipate that, but I don't know if you encountered that as well. But I guess that's the butter. But that's a great episode.
I think it's the butter, and yeah.
Yeah. If you would like to try this recipe at home, go to Tasting History, go to the YouTube channel and subscribe. And remember to subscribe to the History of Go-Go podcast as well, and that's available wherever you get your podcasts. So, Max, on each episode of Tasting History, you have a featured dish made from an old recipe or even an ancient recipe, and you pair that with really interesting stories, incredible tales of famous people from history. I've watched several episodes myself, never disappointed. You do a terrific job, and the important thing is you make learning history fun, which is not always easy to do. And now you have 300,000 subscribers. I'm sure you never imagined that when you started, but how did it all start for you? How did you start cooking these old and ancient recipes?
So I definitely did not expect to ever have so many people watching, especially in such a short amount of time. My first episode was just back in February. So I've only been doing this since basically the beginning of quarantine. I started baking historical bakes, actually. That was my thing rather than cooking, was just baking, based off watching the Great British Bake Off. I was a huge fan of it, and often they would bake recipes from Victorian England or the 16th, 17th, 18th century, and I loved the stories that they would tell about the history of those foods. And so I would, bake what they had been baking on the show, and often I would bring those into work, or other historical bakes that I had found. I would bring them into work, and last Christmas, someone at work said, you should put this on YouTube. You tell great stories about the food, and it's interesting. So either they were encouraging me to branch out, or they were just sick of hearing about it and said, go tell someone else. I don't know which one it was, but either way, they planted the seed to start a YouTube channel, and a few months later, I did. I found that I had the time as I was furloughed from work, so why not?
Well, it's truly interesting, and it has to be difficult to take some of these ancient writings. It's not even really cookbooks. They're just ancient writings, and then turn them into a modern recipe. Could you kind of describe that challenge that you encounter as you produce one of your episodes?
Yeah. So recipe is kind of a nebulous term, because sometimes it's, a very precise set of instructions. Fantastic. But that's a relatively recent thing, only in the last couple hundred years. Before that, it was usually just a list of the ingredients and sometimes some information on the process of doing it, of making it. And they would often leave things out, either ingredients or parts of the process, because they were written for people that already knew how to cook, knew how to do the dish. So it was kind of, they won't add salt or tell you to bake something in the recipe because they assume that you already know that. And so it's hard to know what they assume. It's hard to know what people knew back then. In fact, it's almost impossible. So there's a lot of guesswork. And the further back you go in history, the less specific they get, to the point that, I made a recipe, or I made a dish called Cuisine. It was not from a recipe. It was not from, there were no recipes. It's from ancient Greece. It is from a couple descriptions of a dish that we have from Homer and some other ancient Greek texts. None of them agree with each other. So, you're kind of having to guess and make your own version. And it's literally just 4 ingredients and no description of anything else. So it's a lot of guesswork. And my version is almost certainly not what they had, because the variables are just too many. We'll never know what they actually had. So it gets harder the further back you go.
But it's probably fun to try that, to try to say, okay, I'm going to try
to try that.
Right.
Yeah. It's because it's all fun. Some people take it very seriously, but for me, both cooking and history should be fun. I'm not a professional chef. I'm not a professional historian. I'm a gentleman scholar, as some might say. And so it's as long as I'm getting something out of it and the audience is getting something out of it, that's good enough for me. So, yeah.
So let's I'm going to touch on a few people. We'll kind of focus on the history part, although I will ask you for one of your recipes that you do. But let's start with Pliny the Elder. He comes up from time to time in so what's his importance? I know from history, and mine's a little superficial on Pliny the Elder, but I know that he had written down pretty much everything he could encounter in that ancient Greek time period. Is as crazy as how much an elephant weighs, or things like just out there. So how is he used in your preparation for those ancient recipes?
So Pliny is a great and dubious resource for all things ancient Rome. He lived kind of right when the Roman Empire was really revving up. It was,
that's
the
right.
first
Roman.
century.
I said Greek. You're exactly right. Roman.
No, that's right.
Because
There's
he died.
Because he writes. He died in when Vesuvius.
Right.
Erupted.
Yes. Correct.
So his importance in history and everything is only because he wrote stuff down. You know how they say history is written by the victors? Well, sometimes history is written by the people who write stuff down, and that was Pliny. A lot of the things he wrote down are erroneous and just factually inaccurate, but they're all that we have because somebody else didn't write it down. So, keep a diary, and in 2,000 years, people will trust you to be the authority. But because he wrote down so many things about so many subjects, when it comes to food, we can often go to him for just a list of what kinds of grains were they using, what kinds of wheat, what kind of meat was being used, and how was it slaughtered, and where did it come from, and what were the people eating back then. So because he just wrote everything down, he's a great resource, because he's not what a lot of people wrote things down back then, but he wrote copious amounts of things. So he's a good resource, even though sometimes you have to take it with a grain of salt, because just like everyone, people are biased. And he was a good friend of one of the emperors, and so he was into the political sphere. So of course, some of the things he's going to write have a political slant and things like that.
So one of the things, as I watch your show, and you go into these old ancient texts and you pull out these types of spices and so forth, that it doesn't even sound like it even exists anymore. How much of it is a challenge for you when you get those types of situations, maybe a spice that doesn't even exist anymore, to try to replicate that? How often do you encounter that?
Sometimes, there's one spice called silphium that we know is extinct. It actually went extinct during the Roman Empire, but they ended up using a different spice called asafoetida, which was supposed to emulate the flavor. It was much lesser than silphium, but because they thought that it emulated the flavor, we can assume that spice can be used instead. So there are things like that. Then there are certain ingredients that we don't know if they're extinct or not, simply because we don't know what they were referring to. They would say a word, and we think maybe it refers to this plant or this herb, but we don't know. And so it's all kind of just a guess. And there are far smarter and far more knowledgeable food historians who have done a lot of that legwork to make educated guesses.
Okay.
And so I rely on them to inform me of those kinds of things.
So another individual that comes up in your shows is Apicius, and he lived a very interesting life. What's his importance in the understanding of ancient cookery? Yeah,
so Apicius, again, 1st century into the early 2nd century, I believe, he was a famous gourmand living in and around the city of Rome. He was friends with the wealthiest and the highest upper echelons of the empire, and he prided himself on having these huge banquets with all sorts of outlandish dishes, and ended up going broke because of it and killing himself because he couldn't afford to have these anymore. But what actually makes him important from a historical context is not necessarily his work, but is the tradition that he kind of codified of starting to write down recipes, because he wrote several cookbooks, most of which are lost, but some of those recipes have survived in a book called the Coquinaria, which was written 300 years later, but it has tons of recipes from those 300 years, and often in his style. And sometimes they're attributed to him. We don't know if he actually wrote them. The whole book is attributed to him. And obviously he didn't write it 300 years after he died. But his tradition of writing down about food and just being a gourmand in general is what makes him so important to ancient Roman cuisine.
And the De Coquinaria is it considered the oldest cookbook in Western civilization? So
again, cookbook is, these terms are
modern term.
Yeah, they're modern terms. Most people would consider it, definitely the oldest in Europe. There are some writings from the Middle East that are earlier, but again, they're not really cookbooks. They're just kind of recipes written on tablets and whatnot. But this is the oldest full text of recipes that we have in the West.
So in you have these areas that you focus on, and ancient Rome is definitely one. And one of the ingredients that just kept coming up, and I know this from watching your show, is garum. And the whole story of garum is interesting to me. So could you explain what garum is, what's it made of, and how is it used in Roman cooking?
Yeah, so garum is fermented fish sauce. It's basically you would take a layer of whole fish, though sometimes it was pieces of fish, but fish, and then put that into a jar, topped with salt, then topped with herbs, then more fish, salt, herbs, all the way up until they were filled. And when I say jar, they were often huge vats, filled up, and then left out in the sun for several months to ferment and decay. And what you're left with is a salty but very flavorful umami kind of sauce, very similar to the fish sauces that we find in Eastern Asian cooking today. Really, the main difference is the type of fish that was used and the herbs that were used. But other than that, they're very, very similar. And it was in almost all Roman food, even their desserts, because Romans didn't add salt to their food. They used this in order to add salt, much like Japanese cuisine often adds soy sauce to bring salt into a dish.
So is garum actually extinct at this point, and it's just now we call it fish sauce, or is that lineage just kind of connected so you don't consider it extinct?
Well, I wouldn't consider it extinct. I would say that it's just changed.
Okay.
They really stopped using it for a long time, except supposedly in certain parts of southern Italy, where to this day you can get something called colatura di alici, which I use in many of my recipes instead of as garum, and it's supposedly made in very much the same style, probably using the same fish, which are anchovies. They use anchovies or tuna or mackerel, but colatura di alici, I believe, uses anchovies and many of the same herbs that would have been used. So again, it's one of those things we don't know exactly what it would have tasted like because we don't know the exact herbs that were used. But this is going to be very, very close. And 2,000 years later.
I know that one was a challenge for you when you did it. Moving on.
It was, partly because I made a quick version of it. I did not ferment.
You didn't wait 2 months? You didn't wait?
There's actually an old ancient Greek recipe, or Byzantine recipe rather, for a quicker version, which is what I ended up making.
So moving on to medieval cooking, which is another emphasis of your show. One of the things I thought was one of the shows I really enjoyed was the one on trencher or trencher bread. Can you explain trencher bread and how it was used?
Yeah. So trenchers were typically, originally they were typically bread that had been baked in a stone or wood-fired oven would often burn on the bottom, especially because they put 30 loaves in, and the heat wouldn't be the same everywhere. So some loaves would get burned, or bread would be left out and it would get stale. So this bread that wasn't top notch, they would slice up and use as plates, because nothing would get thrown away. It was just too precious. So they would use them as plates and serve the food onto these trenchers that would soak up the juices and everything. Now, the poor people then would eat those trenchers because it was bread, or they would give it to the dogs or the pigs or whatever. The wealthy, on the other hand, in the Middle Ages, would often bake bread simply for the use of trenchers, which was a way of showing off their wealth. It was a way to say, I'm so wealthy that I can bake bread and use all of these ingredients just to use it as a plate that I'm not going to even eat. And then I'll give it to the servants, the dogs. And they were used for a very long time. They had plates, but they were more used for serving. So the plate of food would come out to the table, and then people would take things off the plate and put them onto their trencher. And there are stories of certain kings having meals where they would go through 50 trenchers in a meal. So they would put food on it, eat it, toss the trencher. Put food on it, eat it, toss the trencher, which is so wasteful, which is how you showed your money.
Yes. Could you explain since we're talking about the medieval time period, some of the cures that the Europeans had for the bubonic plague, and then you had a show where you described the four humors, and I just thought that was really interesting. Could you basically just give an overview of some of those food cures for the bubonic plague, and then what the four humors were, or humorism?
Yeah. So some of the cures were things like horseradish, certain herbs, and sometimes they were foods not meant to be eaten, but meant to be stuffed into the buboes that had exploded. You would stuff things in there, and there actually is some evidence that
that's a horrible image.
Actually worked.
That's a horrible image.
It is a horrible image. Some of those things may have actually worked, like taking certain herbs, putting them in urine, and then stuffing the wounds, and there would actually be antibacterial elements to it. So maybe they worked from time to time, but probably not. Another food that they used was apple. They thought might be a cure. None of them were, of course, when you ate these things. But what it was it was based on a theory called the four humors, which had come all the way from ancient times and persisted until the 19th century, and even today persists in some Eastern cultures. And basically, it's the thought that these four humors, or bodily fluids, blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile, control your health, they control your mood, they control everything about you. And the best thing to do is to keep them in balance. If they go out of balance, you can get annoyed, you can get sad, you can get depressed, you can get sick, including with the bubonic plague. And so you would take these foods that were considered to be cold and wet and hot and dry in different degrees and eat them to balance out those humors. Didn't work, but
yeah, but that's pretty amazing. And I really enjoyed that episode too. So moving along a little bit, another, I guess, I don't know if we want to use another form of the way they wrote cookery down. So I'm trying to avoid the word cookbook, Max, but you're teaching me a lesson here. But how about
you can use cookbook.
Okay, thanks, Max. So the form of curry, explained how it was used, the form of curry. And I know that it wasn't in a book format originally. I think it was on a huge scroll. But what was the form of curry?
So the form of curry, sometimes it's referred to as the form of curry, depending on the pronunciation, was a series of recipes written down by the chefs of King Richard II of England. And so over about a 10-year period, from about 1390 to 1399 or so, many of Richard's favorite recipes were written down by his chefs or scribes in the kitchen. And so we get a wonderful glimpse at what was being served to the royalty of that day. And it's the first cookbook, I'll use the term cookbook, in English. Though some of the recipes are in more of French, which was being spoken at the court. It's one of my favorites. It's kind of what brought me to old cooking. And there's just so much interesting history around it, and the dishes are so varied, from things that are absolutely delicious to things that are mad. I can't imagine eating porpoise pies and things like that. So, but it's a wonderful glimpse into the history of the time.
So Richard II, in one of your episodes, you also mentioned the Feast of the Duke of Lancaster, which was important in history. And I don't think, if I remember it right, the Duke of Lancaster was even present at that feast. Well,
I don't want to say 100% that he wasn't. It's just a little odd, because here's a feast for the Duke of Lancaster, who was Richard II's uncle, John of Gaunt. But the problem is John of Gaunt had left for Spain almost a year before, 6 months before, I think. And he wouldn't come back for quite some time, at least according to what was written down. So did he come back just for the feast? I doubt it. So what it could have been was something to honor his uncle's journey to Spain in trying to recapture the Spanish throne for himself. We don't know, but it's a weird part of history. But what makes it historically significant in food terms is that we know absolutely everything that was served at the feast. They wrote down all of the foods and all of the ingredients, and the ingredient list is it's mind-boggling how much food was being served at this feast, and it signifies the feeling of the king being just way too luxurious at the time. He was spending way too much money on things, on frivolous, what they considered frivolous things. And that is what eventually led to his downfall, amongst other things. You know, history is very complex, but it was that sentiment of just spending way too much of the taxpayers' money, and by taxpayers, I mean the wealthy people who were giving him money, on things like feasts that led to his fall.
They just could not afford it. And that, you know, that's a stark difference between the way the average person was living and then the feast for the Duke of Lancaster. So for a few of these ingredients, which are modern ingredients, but when were they first used? So I got a couple of ingredients that I want to talk about because they come up from time and time again. And there's this thought, and you must encounter it from time to time, where people will say, well, you can't put sugar in that because they didn't have sugar. So for sugar, when is it first used in Western cooking or in Europe?
So sugar, actually, a lot of people think that sugar is a New World food because of the sugar cane that was being cultivated by the slaves in the Caribbean and the very southern parts of Mexico and Brazil. But actually, it's an old world food. They have had sugar cane in Europe for thousands of years. It had been brought over. Sugar cane came from Indonesia and that area, and it would be transported over to North Africa and the Levant, and then in Cyprus, it would be refined. So at that point, you would either have something that would be kind of like brown sugar today, or they would refine it into white sugar. It wouldn't be exactly like the white sugar that we have now, but it would be white sugar. And that then was very popular in the Middle Ages. It came to England, I think that the supposed date is around 1080, 1090. So it's been around for a long time, but it was so expensive that most people weren't eating it. Most people were getting their sugar from honey. And one of the points of Columbus traveling, of course, was to find a faster way to India to get these spices such as sugar. And when he got to the Caribbean, he and the people that followed him realized this is the perfect place to grow sugarcane. So they took sugar from Spain, which was being grown in Spain and Portugal, and brought it over to, I think it was actually the Portuguese who ended up bringing it over to the Caribbean to be cultivated. And that then stopped the trade of sugar from the Far East because it was a lot cheaper to get it from Brazil and the Caribbean than it was to get it all the way from Indonesia. So that's why we often think of it as a New World food. It's an Old World food, but it was extremely expensive and only eaten by the very, very wealthy, and eaten in a way that we would not typically eat it today because there was no concept of, dessert is sweet and the meal is savory until a French author in the, I want to say the 1680s. So before that, the meal could be both. And so you find a lot of these recipes that have, the sauces are very sweet that are going on to meat, sweet and savory. So it's almost like a barbecue sauce in that flavor combination. So it's interesting.
So another ingredient, and you tell a really interesting story, is the tomato, because that is a New World food. But because of some of these tales that you hear, even as a school child, you hear like, well, they didn't eat it at first because people thought it was poisonous. And then we get into the whole argument, is it a fruit or is it a vegetable? So if you can handle the tomato for me, kind of explain why they thought it was poisonous first, and then finish up, just settle this today, right now, Max. Is it a fruit or vegetable?
So they thought that it was poisonous because it was being served on, one, it looked, and it is in the same family as deadly nightshade and some poisons of the day. So it looked a lot like them, like belladonna. But they thought that it was actually killing people because it would often be served on pewter plates to the wealthy who could afford pewter. And pewter has lead in it. And it's fine to eat off of in small quantities as long as the food isn't very acidic. Because if it's acidic, it'll leach out the lead, and tomatoes are very acidic. So that proved to be a problem. I go with the idea that tomato is a vegetable. I side with the United States Supreme Court. I say that it's a vegetable because of the way that it's eaten and the way that it's treated. Is it technically a fruit? Yes, by scientific standards, it is technically a fruit, but it's a vegetable in the way that it's treated. So I go with vegetable.
So the Supreme Court had to, this is so important that the Supreme Court had to rule on it. So what's the story of that?
So there was, John Nix was an importer in New York City of fruits and vegetables, and he was importing tomatoes, and they had put a tax on importing vegetables. And so they were putting a levy on him, or a tariff. And he said no, because it's a fruit. And they ended up taking it to court. It went all the way up to the Supreme Court, where eventually he lost when the Supreme Court said, it's a fruit, but it's a vegetable for taxation purposes.
So even the Supreme Court has ruled on this. That's pretty interesting. Another individual that comes up in a lot of your episodes, and this person seems extremely important in modern cooking, from the innovations that we would consider today as modern cooking, Hannah Glasse. Could you explain the importance of Hannah Glasse and some of her recipes? And I know you're a big fan.
Yeah. So I love Hannah Glasse. I love her way of writing. She's very conversational. She makes her cookbook fun to read. One interesting thing about Hannah Glasse's book is that it was one of the first very successful books that was written not for the chefs, but for the servant in the domestic house, and the cooks that were often women that were just coming up in society at the time. So she, with tongue in cheek, she dumbs down a lot of the way that recipes had been written before, which were very lofty often.
And so she makes fun of a lot of those French chefs.
Yes, indeed. Yes, indeed. And I mean, definitely watch the episode, because there are some wonderful quotes directly from the book that I, don't have offhand. But they're hilarious. Whether they were, you never know how serious things are when we can't get into her head, but regardless, they're funny. And some of the recipes in there are just wonderful recipes that we still have around today. And her methods, we remained because she was English, but the book became extremely popular in America, and people like Ben Franklin and Thomas Jefferson had copies, and it grew and ended up becoming, some of the American versions have the first recipe for hamburger and things like that. So it was an important book.
So for those interested, if you want to know about Hannah Glasse, Max does a great job, so go to that episode. Now, you don't necessarily have to give us the full recipe, but if somebody wanted to create one, could you give some of the ingredients and how you make Syllabub?
Yes. So her episode, the episode where I really talk about her, is in the Syllabub episode. And essentially what that dish is, and it's everlasting Syllabub, because there have been two different forms, one that split between liquor and cream and one that stayed together, the everlasting. And that's what I make. So it's heavy cream, sweet wine like a port or a sherry, and then some orange, some lemon, lots of powdered sugar, and some orange blossom water. And it's basically just all whipped up into a whipped cream, and it ends up becoming kind of like a stabilized alcoholic whipped cream. But it's not overpowering in flavor. It's pleasant and wonderful for warm weather especially. But what makes it interesting is that you can swap out different liquors or different flavorings to have a whole host of desserts. It's wonderful.
Have you used it just in modern things, like thrown it on a pastry or a cake? Have you done that? Have you done just normal cooking and said, well, I'm going to put some Syllabub together and put on top of that?
You know what? I haven't, but I'm going to. What I actually want to do is, I think it's going to go very well with gingerbread come Christmas. I'll leave out the orange blossom water probably, and just use maybe a little bit of lemon and cinnamon or something like that. But I think it'll be really good on gingerbread. So I'm looking forward to that.
So we're going to have Christmas Syllabub here too, Max, just in your honor.
Excellent. Excellent.
So another English recipe, and I enjoyed this discussion you had about the Sally Lunn Bun and your trip to Bath, England. What is the Sally Lunn Bun?
So the Sally Lunn Bun is a loaf of, or not a loaf, it's a bun, a bread, kind of a brioche that is served at the Sally Lunn House in Bath, England, which has been there since the 1600s. Actually, the building has been there for quite a bit longer, but the Sally Lunn House has been there since the 1600s. And it's just a wonderfully soft and sweet dish that's just fantastic. And I can't say enough good things about it. I love making it. I love eating it. But it just has a fascinating history around the city of Bath, which is one of my favorite places in the world. It's one of the most charming and historically significant places in England, and I love it.
And I think I heard a story that you had mentioned maybe on one of your interviews where you said you were there, you wanted to try the Sally Lunn Bun, but the line was so incredibly long that you thought, well, I'm going to have to go back to America and I'm never going to try Sally Lunn Bun. And then fortuitously, something happens in your favor.
Well, so the line is always very long. It's one of those tourist traps that's actually worth it. So it's a very small place. But one day when I was walking back to my hotel, and I was staying at a B&B just across the courtyard from, the line was gone. It was late in the day. The weather wasn't too great. And so the line was gone. So I just walked right in and went downstairs, and someone was there to show me the museum that they have downstairs, where they actually have the original oven that they would make them in, and the molds. And it was perfect. And I took one of those buns back with me to America. It was excellent.
Is that one of those recipes where your viewers send to you and say, I tried the Sally Lunn Bun? Is that one of the most famous one, or the most used by your listeners and your viewers?
Yes. I think that the Sally Lunn Bun and the Syllabub are actually the two most popular. Partly because I think that my enjoyment of the Sally Lunn Bun made people want to do it. And then when it comes to the Syllabub, it's just the easiest thing that you could possibly make. So I think that that's why a lot of people try that as well.
So moving on to America, you had an episode where you focused on a 4th of July dish. And I think it was featured in Martha Washington. And most people know that these cookbooks from Martha Washington have been passed down for years and years. And similar to the ancient cookbook you mentioned before with, I think, Apicius, they may have not all been actually Martha's recipes, but you actually cook one up and you tell a story about the celebration of the 4th of July. And I'm going to read a little quote from John Adams, and then I'm going to let you talk about the 4th of July meal that you cooked and why John Adams just never really accepted the 4th as Independence Day. So here's John Adams. This is what he says. It's pretty interesting. He says, the 2nd day of July, 1776, will be the most memorable epoch in the history of America. I am apt to believe that it will be celebrated by succeeding generations as the great anniversary festival. It ought to be commemorated as a day of deliverance by solemn acts of devotion to God Almighty. It ought to be solemnized with pomp and parade, with shoes and games, sports, guns, bells, bonfires, and illuminations from one end of the continent to the other from this time forward forevermore. Now that's amazing, Max, but there's a problem with that quote. It says the 2nd day of July. What's the problem there?
Yes. So the 2nd day of July is actually when the Declaration of Independence was voted on, and kind of accepted at first, and so that should be the day of independence, according to John Adams. The 4th of July is when the final version was voted and agreed upon, because they spent a couple days making some changes. And then it wasn't even signed until a month later, and the signings actually trickled in all the way through Christmas. So there's, John Adams was very particular.
Yes,
and
very particular.
Very particular, and had his opinions, and his opinion was that the 2nd day of July, which was the day that everyone said, yes, this is the Declaration of Independence, we are declaring our independence, that should be Independence Day, not 2 days later when the final version was adopted. So
even the next year,
he never gave up the fight.
Right. That's just so interesting, because the very next year, almost everyone else, I think including George Washington, celebrated on the 4th of July in 1777. But he, even years later, he almost refuses to go to these events because it's the 4th and not the 2nd. Do I got that right?
Yep. Yeah. He was wonderfully stubborn. And it's just interesting because he and Thomas Jefferson, of course, who everyone knows, wrote the majority of the document. They both died on the same day in 1826, I believe, which was on the 4th of July. So even his death on the 4th of July is kind of like an extra little jab.
Poor John Adams. Poor John Adams. So that dish that you created to celebrate the 4th of July, what was that dish again? And I was wondering, in the dish, you actually make, I think it's salmon, but you have 2 different ways of cooking it. So could you describe what the dish was and the 2 different ways of cooking the salmon?
Yeah, so the entire meal would have been salmon and new potatoes with salmon with egg sauce, new potatoes, and turtle soup. I did not make the turtle soup or the potatoes. I focused just on the salmon and the egg sauce. And the egg sauce ended up being something kind of similar to cross between a bechamel and a hollandaise, but not as rich. But the salmon, the way that it's boiled salmon, and the way that it's boiled is in a mosquito netting. So I ended up using a cloth that has the similar texture to mosquito netting. You could use cheesecloth as well. But so I did one in the mosquito netting just to see if it really made a difference, and then one out of the mosquito netting. And it ended up making a little bit of a difference. But the reason turns out it's probably that it was easier to get the fish in and out of the water. Because instead of just using, I made just a fillet because it's just me, but really the recipe does not specify. So you could be making an entire salmon if you wanted to, and putting that in there with the bag made out of mosquito netting might be easier to get out.
Yeah, because
it
trying to
break up.
You're right. Trying to get it out would definitely break up. So I have one last little area to discuss: the American Civil War. And around here locally, we had a lot of individuals that were involved in the Civil War. Our founder of our town was actually the governor in 1860 of Illinois. But you came across some recipes for convalescing Union soldiers. Could you explain how they were basically fed, those Union soldiers?
Yeah. So it's a book called The Hospital Steward's Manual, and it was a manual that was written in 1862 to let stewards basically know how to do their job, because many of the people who got that job, it was a coveted job, and many people who got it were not at all qualified to be hospital stewards. It's a very important job as well. And so it talks about the entirety of that position and how to do it. But one section is on the foods, because the steward was in charge of the kitchens. And he goes through and just talks about the different foods that would be served to people as they convalesce in different, depending on how sick they were or whatever. And really, for the most part, they weren't eating that well. They weren't eating very, very much. But there are some recipes in there that sound really quite good, really nice Irish stews and things like that, or the bread pudding that I made, lots of desserts, alongside some very unappetizing dishes that you might think of more when you're thinking of hospital food. But it's just an interesting glimpse into a part of the Civil War that we don't usually learn about. Usually you learn about the battles and maybe the politics going on, but what happened after the battle and what happened, and more people died during the Civil War from illness than they did from actually getting shot in battle. So the hospitals were extremely important, and they're part of the history that is often neglected.
There's no question about that. The last question I have for you, Max, is what period of history, or what are you kind of hoping to do that you haven't done yet?
So right now I am knee-deep in Chinese history. There are some wonderful Chinese recipes that I'm finding from the Ming Dynasty and other areas. So that's what I'm working on. I'm also just, I love European history and medieval history. And so that, I think, is always going to be kind of my focus. But I do want to expand. A few weeks ago, I did India, which was my first foray out of Europe or America. And I'm going to be doing something next week where I talk about the Aztec civilization. So, food and history there's so much to it. It's never ending. I'll have content for years. So while I focus on Europe, I don't want to be exclusive to Europe, mainly because I learn a lot more when I leave Europe, because it's all new to me, which is the reason I'm doing this is really so I can learn.
How often do you get people come up, hey, Max, here's what you should do? Here's one recipe. You got to do this. You got to do that. Does that happen pretty frequently?
I'd say between 20 and 30 times a day, I get messages or emails. Yeah. And you know what? Some of them are really wonderful suggestions. And I've actually taken some of these wonderful suggestions. So I encourage people to continue to do it. Many of them are, they're just not things that, because there's a lot that goes into it other than just picking a dish. I do like to work from primary sources. So I like to have old recipes if possible. And some things just don't have that. So I won't be able to get around to everyone's dish. I currently have a list of about 400 things. So that's, about 8 years worth of content for me. That's how I'm learning, is to pick through these things that people are sending me. So I encourage it. Don't stop.
Well, Max, it's going to have to be 401 because I'm going to give you one if it's okay.
Excellent.
I always thought, and I love the Christmas Carol, or A Christmas Carol, Charles Dickens. And that when the Cratchits get together and Mom makes this, I think it's plum pudding, and the father tastes it. Maybe at Christmas time, do a Christmas Carol episode. Just that's my suggestion.
It's funny you mentioned that. Right in front of me, right now, I have a book called Modern Cookery for Private Families by Eliza Acton. It was written just after the Christmas Carol was written, and it has the first recipe for Christmas pudding. Before that, it was simply called plum pudding. This is the first recipe for Christmas pudding, and I am doing a Christmas Carol history episode for Christmas. So your wish is my command, sir. It will be done.
Thank you. I would like to thank our guest today. What a wildly successful show, and I would encourage anyone, not just for the food, which is really interesting and cool, but for the stories. You do such a great job, Max. So anybody interested, go to Tasting History with Max Miller, the YouTube channel, and I want to thank him today. You did put us in the shoes of those famous men and women, so thank you for that today. And sharing thank you very much. I really appreciate it. Our featured brew was hot buttered beer, and if you would like to try that 4 centuries old recipe, go to Tasting History with Max Miller. He'll guide you right through it. The music was provided by the band Bones Fork, and it's available on iTunes, Spotify, everywhere you download or purchase your music online. And remember to subscribe to the podcast wherever you get your podcasts, like our Facebook page, and like Tasting History's Facebook page. And I want to thank Max one more time, and join us again next time when we talk, think, and drink on History A Go-Go.